Good morning. I'm going to call our budget hearing to order, our budget meeting, I guess, to order. Ask you to stand for the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Okay. So we have an agenda, and I'd look for a motion to approve our agenda.
So moved.
Second.
Motion and a second. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, same sign. Motion carries. All right, we are going to begin our budget presentation with an overview from Tom Greco, our administrative officer. Good morning, Tom.
Good morning, Commissioners. Tom Greco, Commission Administrative Officer. So I'm just going to kick this off, but do want to start by obviously thanking everyone for being here this morning, but particularly to the auditor and the auditor's office for putting this budget together and the various departments. You'll see a lot of work's been put into this. You'll receive a lot of information today. At the end, we will ask for some guidance. There may or may not be some, because we won't have specific questions, but do want to tee it up and let you focus on some of the key things within the budget. So we'll give you an overview of county finances, talk about the recommended budget in and of itself, the total amount, but really focusing today on the general fund and the building fund. Talk about debt service, introduce you to the preliminary means of finance, which you'll be revisiting several times over the next several months. We'll have Human Resources Director Carrie Deaver up here talking about personnel and personnel requests. I'll wrap up sort of the formal presentation with vehicles and outside agency requests. Again, those will just be introductory, letting you know what's out there. We'll hit them again next week, and then ask for any guidance that you may or may not have. But before we dive into it, just wanted to revisit our timeline. So over the course of the next few weeks, we'll have these budget meetings. You do have an opt-out. You do have a deadline to consider an opt-out resolution of July 15th. Now, that's separate and distinct from levying any opt-out, but just want to make sure that it's on your radar screen. And then, of course, the next big step is to file the provisional budget with the auditor. So that could be published and notice provided for the public hearing on September 2nd, and that may continue through final budget adoption on September 23rd. And then one last thing regarding the timeline is just the fact that we do have some joint budgets with the city of Sioux Falls, particularly for Metro, Siouxland museums, and the library system. Those hearings will be held on August 27th in a joint session with the Sioux Falls City Council. Just wanted to remind you and the folks in the audience about who we are and what we do. You can see over here to the left a very extensive organization. Certainly 5 elected departments that are across the top over here. We do operate a jail, and then the various departments that fall under the direct supervision of the commission. Over here to the right are various other functions that the county supports, in most cases statutorily. And speaking of that, overall, what we do as a county, we're required to do 90% of what we do of where our budget dollars go is statutorily required. So we don't really have a choice about a lot of the things that we're doing, particularly when it comes to public safety and justice. There are clear needs within the community. You'll see that theme kind of reiterated throughout the course of this presentation. And then down there on the bottom, there are some other things that are not necessarily statutorily required. About 4% go towards operational and other contractual type needs. Those are things like human resources or IT, not specifically mandated by state law, but it sure does help to have them in an organization this size and for the types of things that we do. And then, of course, there are other things that are within our budget that we'll hit on throughout the course of the next several meetings. But just remember that as we're going through this, the huge investment that the county's made in public safety and justice, but also in those other areas that help us sustain ourselves and provide the best service that we can to the public. So with that, I am going to turn it over to our Finance and Budget Officer, Susan Beeman, and she'll spend about the next hour talking through the budget itself.
Good morning, Susan Beeman with the Auditor's Office.
Morning, Susan. Before you start, Susan,
Yes.
we had invited numerous legislators to this meeting, and maybe more will come, but just want to shout out to Representative Jack Colbeck for being here this morning. Thank you, Jack.
As we get started, we're just going to do a quick highlight over 2021 through 2026 budgeted revenue and expenses. This first slide shows our budgeted resources or revenue for that time period. As you can tell, property taxes is the primary source of revenue for the county. That does continue to increment up as we are aware with CPI and growth, those are going up. Other revenue sources kind of bounce around a little bit, but they continue to be fairly flat as far as those sources go. Moving into to the expenditure budget. So we have 7 categories on this slide for that same time period. The one that I'm sure jumps out at you right from the beginning is public safety and justice. Those costs include all of our Sheriff's Department related expenses, JDC, the jail, but it also includes public defense, the prosecution through the state's attorney's office, as well as courts costs. So you can see that continues to increment up at a fairly high rate. Other areas, there are slight increases in general services from as you go through the last 5 years. Health and Human Services, outside agency, cultural and other miscellaneous remain fairly flat with slight increases as well. Highway, they do, you've seen some increases here and there. They have obviously some different budgeting processes with major construction projects and timing with that. We won't dive into highway today, so there'll be further information about that at a subsequent meeting. On the capital outlay area, I just want to point out that big jump that you see in the blue bar, that has to do with the Juvenile Justice Center project. So that project will be continually ongoing as we do that. And as I go through these, I'm going to go through them fairly quickly because we have a lot to cover, but at any point, if you guys have questions, please stop me. Diving into property taxes, and we're going to talk specifically about the general fund as we start. The 2026 budget, we have in there just under $65 million in property tax revenue for the general fund. And we often specifically talk about the general fund separately than the other funds that have property taxes, just because that is where the predominant amount of our property taxes are, as well as our budget pressures are in that fund. We do have $15.5 million in opt-out that are included that number, which is roughly 24.1% of our total property taxes are related to opt-out. As we get into what is an increase into this budget, we are allowed to increase by CPI and growth. Preliminary numbers for CPI as reported to us from the state is 2.9%. Which will result in an increase of just over $1.3 million for a CPI increase. Growth is currently at 2.98%, and that will be just under $1.4 million. So a total increase in property tax revenue of just over $2.7 million.
Susan, that might be a good time to stop and clarify a couple things. So about 25% of our property tax levy is in the form of an opt-out.
Correct.
And then when we talk about CPI and growth, those are the compounding increases only on the non-opt-out amounts.
Correct.
So we're only getting kind of credit for roughly 3% CPI and roughly 3% growth on 75% of our property tax revenue stream. The other is static. Is that fair?
Correct. Okay. You do not get CPI or growth on an opt-out, so that remains flat.
Okay.
Okay. This is just a visual slide showing that same information. So you can see just slight increases as we go. Some years are a little bit higher than others, and then just a general overview of that. So one thing we want to talk through is just to remind you about the CPI. We have had a cap on CPI at the lesser of actual or 3%. That's been in place since the mid to late 90s. We wanted to just show you and make you aware of what that cap does from a formula perspective. So we just have 2020 through 2026. So in these 7 years, we've had 3 of those 7 years that we hit that cap. So in 2023, actual CPI that we received from the state notification was 5.3%, but we were capped at 3%. In 2024, it was an 8.5% CPI, we were capped at 3%. And then 2025, it was 3.8, and we were capped at 3%. So generally what that means is our costs are going higher for inflationary reasons, higher than the 3%, but we're only allowed to increase property taxes by the 3%.
And that's not cumulative, that's per year, correct?
That's per year, so that's the factor. So the challenge is those costs compound. And so that's what we're going to show you on this next slide. In the last 20 years, so it's not, doesn't go back all the way back prior to that, we've had approximately 7 times that we've hit that CPI cap in the last 20 years. I think it's maybe 9 years if you go back further. But what this chart shows you is if we were allowed to charge actual CPI in all of those years where we hit the cap, what would our revenue be different? So for 2026, we would actually have $5.4 million more in base real property taxes versus maybe having some of that in opt-out. So that could in theory replace about 33% of our opt-out if we would have been allowed to actually charge an increase by actual CPI. There's nothing that any of us can do about this. This is current law. But we want you to be aware that those caps do have an impact as our costs and our expenses are increasing higher than what property taxes are allowed to increase. There is that delta between those that we have to evaluate and consider opt-outs or other measures to manage.
And I'll just note as well that going forward the next 5 years under SB 216, we'd also have a cap that we have to consider on our growth factor of 3%. So as we look backwards, there would be some years where our growth would have been over 3%, but this same principle would apply. So when we're making our 5-year forecast and whatnot, we're going to need to obviously follow the state law that this year we basically hit it right on the nose, 2.98%. But in some future years, we might be above 3%, but we can only claim a flat 3%.
Correct. So if you go back to look at these 6 years that I had on a previous slide, 3 of the years are above 3%. So in those years, there are some adjustments that I won't go into the weeds on that right now, but in theory, these would have been capped at 3% under SB 216.
Sure.
As we move into forecast conversations, those are included because those will start happening in 2027. But for budget year 2026, there's nothing reflected in the 2026 budget for those caps for SB 216.
Yes, thank you.
So as we move into, just as we've talked about opt-outs, just kind of wanted to discuss a little bit and remind you of what opt-outs we do have. So we do have opt-outs in our building fund as well as our general fund. So the building fund for 2026 will have an opt-out that was originally passed in 2000, which currently does not have a term limit. At some point, there was a change in requirement that we do have to put a term on opt-outs. So that's why as you move further into some of these later ones, you'll see term limits on those. So we have $1,150,000 opt-out on the building fund. You'll notice that when you look at 2026 versus 25, we're decreasing that by $260,000. That decrease is due to this opt-out here was to help pay our human services bond. That bond is paid off in 2025. So in 26, the opt-out goes away and also our debt payment goes away. Where the bulk of our opt-outs is the general fund. So currently we are levying just over $15.5 million in general fund opt-out. We currently have just over $20.1 million in general fund opt-outs that have been approved. That means we have $4,622,000 that we have approved as an opt-out. We just have not elected to levy yet at this point. As you can see here, that those are the shaded lines on this line. A couple things to note, 2026 will be the last year of the 1,625,000 opt-out. So that will be dropping off in 2027. So there'll have to be some consideration on how we manage that dropping off of that opt-out. And then next big one that we will have to evaluate is 2032 will be the last year of a $4 million opt-out. So, and I'll just remind you from the FAN committee that we had about 2 years ago, the Financial Action Network. This was a significant part of our conversations about opt-out needs within the county. And so at their recommendation was to consider passing smaller opt-outs more frequently so that we have ability to meet needs as we go forward. And they also indicated that at this time they don't see a path outside of opt-outs, that opt-outs probably will continue to be a part of our discussion as we move forward. And we'll get through more of that as we move forward as well.
Yeah, I would note one other thing that came out of that FAN committee on the strategy around opt-outs was to opt out 1 year ahead of, like, anticipate your needs basically, and to be one step ahead, 1 year ahead, such that if it would be referred to a vote of the people, there'd be some flexibility to readjust the budget in that next year and find other alternatives potentially. And so I would highlight to my colleagues that with that line item of 1,625,000 dropping off in 27, that is maybe one of the things we need to be looking one step ahead and staying 1 year ahead of opt-outs falling off. So I'm sure we'll spend quite a bit more time talking about opt-outs and what amount we could be thinking about, but that 1.6 million is something that I think we need to have a plan for.
Especially since it is an operational expense one, not a capital expense where we're paying a bond off like we are with the HHS building. So.
As we move into the proposed budget, this slide shows us just the overall budget included for all funds. Total revenue is budgeted at just over $122 million, and total expenditures are just under $132 million. We'll dive deeper today in general fund, building fund, and the debt service fund. Highway fund will most likely be next week, and the other funds we'll touch on as needed throughout conversations. Generally, those other funds are predominantly self-funded funds that are special revenue funds, and they maintain a balance that are self-funding. Also, just to note, this $122 million number does include a net of about $5.5 million as required by SDCL. We are required to hold back 5% of our appropriations as an adjustment to revenue. So that holdback of that 5% of appropriations is included in that $122 million number. So that's about $5.5 million.
So it's not 122 less 5, it's the 5.5's already been.
That's already netted against that.
Thank
So
you.
just for your awareness.
Thank you.
So diving deeper into the general fund, we get into, this is just our overall revenue, and we'll dive deeper into these areas as we move throughout the discussion. Our general fund revenue is just under $89 million. Of that $89 million, $65 million is related to property taxes, and then the next two areas are going to be $13.6 million from charges for goods and services, and intergovernmental revenue is the next category. And we'll dive deeper into those as we move forward. So before we get into specific categories, I want to just do a high-level overview of that change between the 25 budget and the 26 budget. So 26 budget, again, just under $89 million. 25 budget was just under $85 million. So that's roughly a $3.8 million increase. So as we talk through the details of what makes up that increase, we're looking at $2.7 million in property tax revenue increases, as we discussed earlier. The next major item is an increase in investment income of $800,000. Historically, the county has been very conservative in our investment income budgeting approach. Rates have been stable, have not been decreasing so far this year. So we are proposing an increase of $800,000 to bring us to a $2 million budget for general fund. That's still going to be a conservative budget that I think is attainable, considering that interest rates are predicted to drop at some point, but we do think it's attainable. Next major item would be Board of Prisoner, increase of about $224,000. That is an area that potentially could see some increases as we move forward throughout the 26 budget. Jail leadership is evaluating their bed rate currently, and this may be changing throughout this cycle. Okay. Bank franchise continues to be a difficult number to predict, but we do recommend an increase of about $400,000 for bank franchise budget. If you're aware, may remember from 24 revenue, it came in $1.5 million over budget, which was about a $1.1 million increase from the prior year actual. So it does move around a little, but we are comfortable with that number as well. Juvenile diversion, there was a change in rate for successful juvenile diversions. So we've increased the budget for that category to by $210,000. We also have one more year of MacArthur funding for $125,000. That's in the budget that wasn't there last year. So the two areas that you're seeing decreases in at a larger rate would be the juvenile detention, housing, and shelter care. So we did increase rates within our budget, but because Minnehaha County has been using more of our juvenile days, we are predicting a decrease in census for other counties in DOC, which is what's causing that decrease in revenue. And then lastly, opioid settlements. This is really just a transfer to another fund. Recently, we had a commission item where we were asked by Department of Legislative Audit to track that in a special revenue fund. So this is really just moving that revenue to another fund. So it's not a decrease in overall county budget, just changing out of the general fund to a special revenue fund. Okay. I'll pause there before we move forward to see if there are any questions.
Mr. Chair. Good morning, Susan. Just for the information for the general public, maybe you could give us a little rundown of why our opt-out percentage is so high, and maybe a little bit history of that, and why the county has felt it necessary to continue to impose opt-outs.
I think it will be very visual if we can wait probably about 15 minutes to have that discussion, if that would be okay.
Oh, absolutely.
We have some slides that'll talk about history of reserves and where we've been historically, and where you can see some of those increases happening. Predominantly, it's due to increasing public safety costs, is a very high-level statement, but we'll dive deeper into it as we go forward.
Excellent.
So as we dive into the different categories of our revenue area outside of property taxes, you can see that our property tax, our charges for goods and service revenue remains fairly flat from 2025 budget. We did have a slight increase as we got into 2024 actual. The predominant factor for that is really our jail, our jail board of prisoner revenue. The jail saw a flattening of Minnehaha County days, so that allowed them to do more bed rentals out to the U.S. Marshal Services and other agencies. So that allowed us to bring in some additional revenue that was not anticipated. I have been told by jail leadership to not anticipate that staying true as we move into 25 and 26. So that's why you can see that flattening of budget as we move into 26. As far as all the other areas, they remain fairly flat with the exception of that JDC. You can see that there was that slight decrease in the JDC revenue when you see that breakdown on the charges there. Okay. So moving into intergovernmental revenue, these are things coming either from the federal government, from a state, other agents, municipal agencies, things like that, are what are tracked as intergovernmental revenue. So you'll notice for 25 budget as well as 26, they are fairly flat and where we've seen some big spikes in 22, some smaller ones in 23 and 24. Those are all related, those big spikes are all related to ARPA funding, COVID-related money through South Dakota Cares, things like that. Those things will not be a part of 26 budget, just like they're not part of 25. So where we are seeing our budget now for 26 is more that normalized revenue source for the county without those COVID-related funding sources. Moving into fines and forfeits, these are all things that are fairly flat, so we won't dive into this area at all. If you have questions, certainly let me know. Licenses and permits. A couple of things of note here. The big variable area on this is just building permit revenue. So those big spikes are related to increases in building permits over our budgeted number. That can vary year by projects, but we generally meet our target on those. But it does have some years where we've had some bigger permits that, especially in 2023, that you're seeing there. The only thing to note on here that's different for 23 is that we are budgeting cannabis revenue again. We have earlier this year that license was issued. So starting in 2026, we'll have that $30,000 renewal amount coming through the budget every year. Okay. And then as we move into miscellaneous revenue, again, you can see some big spikes. These two spikes here are really predominantly interest income. That was due to higher interest rates in the market, as well as some changing of how interest rates and the rates that we were earning in some of our accounts. We have seen in the last year about a 20% decrease in rates that decrease our earnings slightly. Still a very strong interest return on our investments at this point, but as we all know, we don't control the market, so at some point those are anticipated to go down. So that's where you can see a flattening over here with slight increases for that. Otherwise, there's not much of significance here to go into details unless you have questions on those.
Susan, what did you say our actual interest income so far this year is, or maybe you didn't say that?
I don't have that number off the top of my head of what our actual interest income is. Rates generally that we have been earning are roughly in the low fours right now. Okay. And our investments are preliminarily are primarily in CDs and U.S. Treasuries. So we have a limited amount of areas that we can invest in per state law. So those are really where our investments are. Okay. So moving on to the expense area, our expenses for the general fund are just under $95 million. So we often talk about public safety and justice costs making up a significant portion of our budget. That is still true in 2026 budget. So this slide really breaks that down between purple being public safety, that would be the sheriff's department, the jail, JDC, things like that. The darker red line are going to be legal services. That is going to be public defense, public advocate, and a state's attorney's office. And then lastly, you'll see judicial is this darker blue line. So those are usually what we talk about in the sense of public safety and justice, those three categories. So we've historically said that those three categories make up about 70% of the general fund budget. Preliminarily for 2026, we're up to 71.4% is where those numbers are. So that trend of that being predominantly public safety and justice in the general fund is continuing, if not going slightly higher. Okay. As we move into the details of the general fund change, increase for salaries and benefits, we're going to break it into salaries and benefits. In the next slide, we'll go into all the other expenses. So salaries and benefits for the general fund are increasing to $67.3 million on their proposed budget, which is just under a $5.1 million increase. What is included in that budget is a preliminary 2.7 matrix adjustment. That's just under $1.3 million. Step increases for people as they reach that anniversary date or step date of $547,000. Overall benefit changes for FICA and pension for all the different salary increases are estimated to be about $610,000. Health insurance for employee election changes at $325,000. So just to note, we have included an 8% increase in premiums for employees in this budget. When we put together the 25 budget, we had also included an 8% increase, and that increase did not actually come to fruition. That the rates were steady for 2025. So there really is not a budgetary impact for that 8% increase because that was already in the 25 budget. But what you're seeing here are just employee election changes. So if somebody leaves, they had single, a new hire comes in and they elect family coverage, things like that. Okay. The next larger increase has to do with elections. So 2026 is an election year. So we do anticipate just under $197,000 of overtime and part-time cost to manage the election process for 2026. And then we have just under $104,000 increase for other overtime and part-time in areas such as the jail, the sheriff's department, and JDC. And then the last major item is that $2 million increase. That includes proposed or preliminary numbers for a compensation study adjustment, as well as any other salary changes throughout that's happened between the 25 budget and today. That could be a position that's not being filled, or someone that resigned and the position was backfilled at a different level. All those other compensation changes are included in that. Okay. So moving into the other expenditure, including capital section of the budget, we were at $28.9 million for 2025, and we were actually proposing a $1.5 million decrease to the general fund. That is just over $27.3 million for 2026. So just to note the major items making that up, top of the list is elections. So again, 2026 is an election year. So we'll have other expense increases of $487,000 related to elections. So between the salaries and the other expenses, you're looking at just under $700,000 of expenses just to run elections for 2026. The next two areas are related to the jail, increases in board of prisoner meals, as well as inmate health services are included. And county insurance have about $109,000 increase. The next line for a decrease of $194,000 mental illness, I'm going to talk about that in conjunction with Human Services Hospital decrease of $400,000. Both of those two areas have seen a decrease in hospital costs, which both departments are attributing to more people having insurance. So we've seen more coverage with Medicaid expansion and more people qualifying for that area. And so we've seen a significant decrease, especially in human services for the county being asked and to pay these bills for individuals without insurance and that qualify for services. We don't know how long, if this will hold in the long term. So I just want you to be aware of that as Medicaid rules change, Medicaid work requirements happen. Those are both areas that we could see upticks in as we go forward in future years. But right now, this is what we know at this time, and so that's how we're budgeting accordingly. And then related to that opioid settlement, as you're aware, we have an annual commitment to the link that the county funds of $400,000. We are using our opioid settlement money to help fund that contribution. So with that revenue being moved over to a special revenue fund, we're also moving the related expense that's funded by that opioid settlement money into that special revenue fund. So this $300,000 decrease is really not a decrease in cost, it's just moving to another fund. Human Services, we have
I just want to put a quick plug in for the link. Prior to the link,
That same amount of money was going into our jail for funding the operation of a detox and sobering center. So it was either spend it there or spend it at the link is pretty much what it came down to. So don't want people to think that, we created a new way to spend money. It was just one pocket to another pocket.
Okay. As we move into the other human services area, we do currently have a grant that's in 2025 for the Just Home Grant. Those expenses are anticipated to be done or are not included in the 26 budget. And the last major item is this facilities select expenses. As we've evaluated budgets, we identified $799,000 of facility-related expenses that were funded in the general fund that were really eligible for the building fund levy. And so we, throughout discussions, are recommending that transfer of budget for those expenses to now have them being serviced out of the building fund dollars versus the general fund budget. Again, not a decrease in expense, it's just moving it to a different source and fund to better make use of the levies in each of those funds.
Could I ask a question about the elections line item? Does that take into consideration the shifting of staff pay from the auditor's office?
Yes, we do increase, we do move some of our budget for auditors overtime and things like that into the elections budget because we do end up working overtime and then some of our hours are completely dedicated to elections, so that does include that.
And that, if I read the material correctly, that's not how it used to be? Is that a change this year?
So the overtime always was. So what we hadn't done in the past was move a portion of our regular salaries over or included in the budget. We had always done it, but it was not a part of the budget. And so this year we wanted to have it be part of the budget. So like election day, I won't tell you how many hours we worked on election day last year, but those regular hours are reimbursed or transferred to the election budget, but now we've just represented that in the budget as well.
Okay, thank you.
And then lastly, I mean, all the other items within this category was about a net decrease of $324,000. One thing that Tom Greco did ask of all department heads was to try to keep this area of our budget as flat as possible. We knew there were budget constraints and to really try hard to not do increases in this area if at all possible. And so what you're seeing are departments really trying to work within that request and to manage that responsibly.
Yeah, I was going to note that exact same point, Susan, and just applaud. We've got a lot of the department heads in the room here today, and I know this says minus 5.2%. If you take out some of the transfer and kind of moving money around, it's relatively flat. But I think it's a testament to how much hard work went into the budgeting process, and so I appreciate Tom's leadership and all the department heads. It looks like, at least at this round, and some potential changes to come yet through this process, but I think you've achieved a lot of good work goes into keeping a budget and keeping your expenses as flat as possible when we've seen a time of inflation, and I know things aren't getting less expensive for you all, so appreciate the work that went into that.
I would second that statement. It was obvious in some of the narratives that department heads worked hard to try to decrease where they could, so thank you.
And then the last summary on this general fund budget just is just a really broad overview of revenue expenses. So revenue is going up $3.8 million. Expenses are going up about $3.6 million. Just to remind you, what's included in that proposed budget, as the numbers you've seen it, is opt-outs remain flat at the 2025 levels. Proposed preliminary matrix of 2.7%. 8% employee insurance premiums. New position requests are excluded in this number. Outside agency donations remain flat at 2025 levels. And then equipment requests and vehicle requests are included in that budget. Okay. So where we get into next is just where does that mean for cash applied and where we like to be for cash applied. So we'll just walk through this again. All of this is very familiar to me, but I know it might not be to everybody else. So I'll walk through this slide in detail. So preliminary projected revenues, just under $89 million. Again, we have that holdback on appropriations from SDCL, 4.7 million. And then we have a transfer to emergency management that we have, as well as our 2026 budgeted appropriations of just under 95 million. So that shows our cash applied at $11.1 million or 11.69% of appropriations. I have added in here just for a visual is if you were to increase number of positions through the requested position process by what we have in our forecast of 750,000 of new positions, that would bring our cash applied up to just under $11.9 million. Historically, the county has used an 8% cash applied target, so that's at 7.6 million. So when we've used that 8% cash applied target, what we're saying is if we can keep our cash applied at 8%, we should not be dipping into reserves or savings. That 8% formula has really come from that 5% holdback on appropriations, where we generally know we're going to collect our revenue. We obtain almost all of our property tax revenue, usually around 99% of our property tax revenue. And then we usually have some underspending on expenses. So that's really where that 8% target came from. And that's been in place for many years for the county. So what that means is with using the 750,000 number, would be at a cash applied rate with that 750 of 12.48%, which would mean that we would be potentially using reserves of a little over $4.2 million. Okay. So as we move into the forecast and some analysis of our reserves, as we move into this, it'll be important to keep this in mind as we talk through this. So as we get into the long-range forecast, things that are included in this forecast is we have talked a lot over the last few years about UC3 expansion in the jail. That is a vacant floor in the jail that we anticipate needing to open sometime within this forecast period. We do have 14 FTEs that have already been approved. We've been able to push that opening out now another year. And so what we do have is UC3 expansion in 3 different phases through 27, 29, 30, and 31. So what you're seeing is roughly 35 more FTEs. Total cost for UC3 expansion is now roughly $4.5 million over all 3 phases. And that's incorporated into this forecast, just so you're aware of that. Additionally, we've included 750,000 of new positions annually. This is something that, obviously is an estimate. Actual requests could be higher or lower, but those 750 is outside of UC3 expansion needs. And then additionally with, yes.
That 750 is a one-time, it's not every year, right?
I do have it every year.
Oh.
So, yeah, just because as every year there's new requests coming forward. So obviously with commission input, we can certainly change that in the forecast. It's easy to do.
Okay.
But we do have that embedded in there every year as a placeholder for consideration as you move forward.
Okay.
And in the past, is that what we've put in as the placeholder, 750, or
We've done it a couple of different ways. In the very beginning, we did 250 or 500,000. The challenge with 250,000 is 250,000 doesn't go as far as it used to. That really is essentially 2 attorneys. So when you look at total needs across the county, that doesn't go very far when you consider all the requests that usually come forward to you. There's nothing magical about 750, so if you have a preference for a lower amount, higher amount, we certainly can easily adjust that. It's easy to manage.
Thank you.
Because to emphasize, that does not include the jail expansion.
The 750 is on top of the jail expansion.
Yes.
Okay. And then additionally, what's also included is a layering of opt-outs in starting in 2027. So through 27 through 2031, we have differing year amounts by years of up to $10 million cumulative of new opt-outs that potentially could be included in this. So what you can see as we move into this forecast, this blue line here that kind of peaks in 2024, that's really our cash reserves. So that includes our unassigned fund balance, along with that $15.5 million that you assigned at the end of 24 for future public safety needs. That's what's included in that number. So as we move into a 5-year forecast beyond 2026, what you can see is a layering down and a leveling down of that line. So even with layering and opt-outs, you see the spending down of those higher level reserves of where we've normally been to get to a level right here of about a 30% reserve rate. Just to remind you, the commission has last year approved a resolution of a 25% minimum unassigned fund balance, just so that we always maintain 3 months of reserves. So the forecast is right now is trying to balance that at around a 29-30% level, just to stay above that policy that was set. Okay. Okay. So
I did have one more question on this slide. I've found the gray line and the green line helpful back to our fan discussion and strategy around layering opt-outs. So the gray line is the total approved opt-out, but we have discretion on whether we levy that opt-out or not. So then the green line is what we actually levy.
correct.
So the gray line has to be equal to or greater than the green line. We can only levy the opt-outs that have been approved. But just kind of watching that step and the staircase of that gray line, always kind of staying one step ahead of the green line, such that if an opt-out were ever turned down by the public, we would have 1 year's worth of wiggle room to adjust there. So just this is kind of a graphical display of what the fan strategy is.
Yes.
So that's my general statement. My question is for 26, maybe without actual numerical values, I'm having trouble reading it, but the gray line, you have something built into your forecast right now of a slight increase in approved opt-out, but no new levy of opt-out, if I'm just reading the graph correctly?
So as far as the approved opt-out in 2026, I don't have any changes in the gray line for approved opt-outs at this point. That'll be part of further discussion and direction from the commission on that. But I do have there's no new opt-outs proposed in the 26 forecast for that line. And that any deficit we would have in our budget would be covered with reserves. But in 2027, that opt-out would be $2.9 million is what's in the 27 year, with 1.6 of that being that replacement of that expiring opt-out.
Okay. Yeah, I just think for my colleague, this is going to be our biggest decision point is what level of cash applied. And we know that the trend lines on both the gray and green line have to increase, and the blue line needs to find a new plateau that we're all comfortable with. But how steep are those curves? So it's the slope of the line that we can make some small impact on in this budget year to affect how steep it is in further years. I know my former colleague, Commissioner Bender, was just big on this point of we don't want to keep things flat for a few years thinking we're saving everybody, taxpayers, on their tax bill, but then they get a huge increase all in 1 year because we realize, oh, now we need it. So kind of layering this in and being flat, I think helps when a lot of people are paying their property taxes through mortgage, escrow, just in monthly expenses. So knowing the practicalities of how people actually pay their property taxes, it might be better to make a small increase in 2026 rather than a huge increase in 2029. So those are just the slopes of those lines and reserves. So I just think this is kind of our lodestar of a graphical display, thinking 5 years ahead. So
Right.
those are
And,
my
and
thoughts.
I was going to mention that as well. As a commission, you could say, you know what, we're not going to levy opt-out until we absolutely need it. So what that would mean is this green line would stay flat until probably 28, 29, and then what you're going to see is a very big increase. And so previous commissions have requested that we try to maintain that in a slow increment and not have any big swings on that, just because we want to be cognizant of any impact to taxpayers. Additionally, there's the thought of, if you have reserves, there could be the thought of, should you just use your reserves until you, and don't do any opt-out? What would this look like without any opt-out? If you kept your expenses flat with UC3 expansion, 750,000 new positions, our reserves would be down to less than 2% by 2031. If you removed all new positions except for UC3 expansion, we'd be down to about 11% reserve by 2031, with spend down of cash by about 5 to 6%. So you would be down in the 1-2% by 2033, 2034. So even without new positions every year, you're looking at opt-outs most likely being still part of our discussion on a regular basis. Just because the increase in costs for the county as we run forward is increasing higher than what the current property tax formula allows. So I just bring that up as we get into the next slide about with our reserves, just knowing that opt-outs are always a tricky conversation, and it's something that we take very serious, that we want to maintain sound financial footing for the county as well.
Susan, the cash applied does or does not include the 95 or the 5% that we have to basically not budget with?
So the cash applied does. So when I look at this forecast, I'm actually assuming that 5% holdback doesn't exist, because generally we receive that money. So I'm projecting that we're going to have that cash available, and I'm also projecting revenue is going to be a little bit higher, and I'm also projecting expenses being a little bit lower. So those are assumptions that are built into this, knowing that historically that has been our case. We're forecasting that in here out as well.
Okay.
And before we move to the next slide, could you just give us briefly a history of how we got to this point with the cash applied? I could try, but I know you'll do it
With
better. It wasn't an accident that we ended up with the peak in 2024.
I think the next slide will help with that.
Okay, thank you.
So as we move into our next slide, which is our reserves, make this a little bigger. So we've included a number of prior years. So we have 2009 up through 2031 forecast. The forecast is what you saw on the previous slide. So I'm probably happy I wasn't here in 2009 and 2010, but in 2010, our reserves were at 1.8%, which was $808,000 in cash. I know that was from talking to people that were here during that time, that was a very challenging time for the county. And what you have seen from 2010 up through really 2021 and 22, you've seen a slight increase of cash available. So this green bar that runs across is that 25% threshold that we have set, that we want to maintain reserves of 25%. So we really didn't meet that threshold within the general fund until 2021. And so Commissioner Heise, you had asked about timing of opt-outs and why they came to be. If you go back and look at that slide and the timing of when many of the larger ones came to be, it was really during this time period, after this really low point where I'm making assumptions that the county commission said, you know what, we need some opt-outs to help balance our budget. Our costs are continuing to increase faster than our property tax formula allows. We need to consider opt-outs. And so that's where you really saw some of that in this time period here. So what is an anomaly on our reserves is 23 and 24. And so that big spike in 24 is significant in the sense that some of it we knew would happen due to some ARPA funding and some acceleration of ARPA funding, but there were many one-time items or unusual things that just went favorable for the county. So things that, and we had a briefing on this back in March, but just to kind of recap, we had Some one-time public defense money came in of about $900,000. We had accelerated ARPA money faster than what we had originally planned in the '24 budget due to changes in direction from U.S. Treasury. We also had $1 million of under expense for employee insurance premiums due to insurance holidays because of stable insurance fund. Bank franchise came in high. Investment income was high. Board of Prisoner revenue was high. We had delayed hiring for UC3 expansion. So all of those things really came into a point where we had some significant dollars coming in '24 that was really not anticipated, nor do we see that happening again. And so what you're seeing here as we move into the forecast is spending down those reserves. So when we talk about this purple line, again, that is our unassigned fund balance plus that $15.5 million that you assigned for public safety. So what we want to do as we go through this forecast is use those reserves responsibly to smooth in opt-out as we move through 27 through 31, but keep our reserves at a stable level at that 30%, 29-30% level. So again, that spike in '24 was really an anomaly. It was a good one for us, but we do have some higher reserves, but it is not going to be indicative of our future. And as we talk about the forecast, we talk about the slide, know that the forecast is something that we have to very closely manage. Like we need to be careful with how we use our reserves. If we are not on track with our budget for '26 and we have expenses that come in high or even '25 budget and our revenues decrease, some of this we'll have to change our forecast. We'll have to potentially change some of our assumptions. We'll have to change some revenue areas or expense areas. But that forecast is really a roadmap of where we're headed to help give us a good planning tool. Okay. Any questions as we move forward? Okay. So moving on to just some things that are not included in the budget, and we'll dive into this a little bit later as well. Personnel requests, we've had 8 new requests that account for $856,000 of increased cost, and then 1 position conversion for a change in a position that's just under $11,000. Additionally, we have 18 agencies, outside agencies that are requesting about a $174,000 increase. Those are not also included in the budget. And then, yes.
The 856, UC3 or not?
None of that is UC3. So Carrie Deaver, when she gets to the HR portion of our presentation today, she will dip into that and dive into that more. Okay. Moving on to the building fund. We won't spend a lot of time on these slides. These are slides that you saw back on June 3rd at the last building committee. We have updated the property tax revenue numbers for 26 through 2030 with the new numbers for projections to match the general fund numbers. So slight change, not significant. Building fund expenses, we have not changed anything on this slide, the same amount. As we move into the fund balance section, I just want to highlight the difference between these two areas. So we have some money in restricted fund balance and we have some money in assigned fund balance. So restricted fund balance are those dollars that are being raised by the property tax levy. So they are set by statute to be used for the purposes of the building fund. And those purposes are identified within statute. The assigned money came from some funding that the previous commissions have moved into this building fund and have assigned for future building needs. Those are dollars that through commission action you could repurpose for something else. You could move it to a different fund. Based upon the FAN recommendations from the 2023 report, their recommendation is to leave the assigned money there until the completion of the master campus plan. Identify what our future building needs are, see how much those are going to be, and then evaluate how to use this money going forward. This could be used to help fund a new building to reduce the amount that we would have to levy through like a bond redemption fund. So at this point, We've just been holding on this pending that master campus plan. Okay? Now with this section, I will turn it over to Mark.
Good morning, Commission. Mark Krenz, Facilities Department. So yes, out of all the projects presented at the Building Committee, the HHS shell space was the only one that needs resolution. To give you a little reminder on that, it's about 1,630 square feet, open shell space. The proposed project would be 2 conference rooms and an open collaboration space. Costs are right there to the left. Estimated $525,000. And Carrie Benz is here to discuss or answer any questions you have about the needs. So,
Carrie, would you like to maybe go over some of your points? Is this just briefly?
Good morning, Commission. Carrie Benz, HS. I think with our space, we've moved into our building back in 2007. And so that space has sat idle in the sense of being utilized for any really type of use other than storage. We currently have a ton of things that are stored up there, obviously, for facilities. And then we also had been using that for our storage for our records, our old records, for somewhat of our filing system. Thankfully, we've been able to now start moving forward on getting rid of those files. So that space that's now present would allow us to be able to expand our ability to have internal meetings in that space. We have 2 classrooms on our floor in HHS, and those are utilized not only by Human Services, but it's also utilized by all the tenants in the building. So that would include if the Multicultural Center / LSS would need to use that space, and then the city also uses that space for meetings. While we also open that up to the community as a space to utilize for free, to hold meetings, etc. Those rooms are utilized all of the time. I don't know that there is hardly a day that goes by that that space isn't utilized. By expanding our shell space and being able to utilize that internally, it would allow us to move some of our meetings internally. It also allows us to keep our current space that we have. We do have 1 small conference room in our current suite space, along with a, quote, larger room that we use as a conference room. Neither one of those can hold our entire staff anymore. They're both too small. So by expanding that space, it would allow us to have our meetings in the shell, what is now the shell space. And then also it preps us for future growth, because we could take then those conference rooms that we currently utilize and turn that into office space. I also appreciate being able to keep the community separate from where we meet with our clientele, those that come and visit our office requesting assistance. It just allows for better privacy. It also allows us for better security. And we have the expansion that we did, or the change that we did in our lobby, has really been so effective in managing our traffic. It allows for us to really maintain a better level of privacy, confidentiality, as well as when we have some challenges with behaviors and those type of things in our building, it just allows us to keep that removed from those that we serve, as well as from taking those individuals within our suite. So this space just allows us a more adequate ability to meet as a staff. It also allows us to have the community enter our space into our suite without having to intrude on space that is also reserved for clientele to come and visit.
Thank you.
Yep.
Quite honestly, this is one that I have a real hard time with, spending $500,000 for 2 conference rooms and some open collaboration space. Yeah. Price per square foot, we could build a prison for that cost. Sorry about that, Representative. I understand the need, it's the cost that's killing me, so.
I'd have to second that as well.
Well, I guess I can give some insight from being in that building frequently. It is, the classrooms are frequently used. There are many tenants, including some of our county personnel, come over there to use those classrooms. I tend to like the idea of the County Human Services being more of a self-contained unit for its service to its clients, rather than having things that spill out of its main suite. Maybe I'd ask a question to Mark of just where this fits, because that's the other thing. It's kind of an artifact of we covered certain things in the building committee, and this was one that just carried over. But maybe it might be helpful to just give context of what some of the other building projects were and that have nominally been approved, might be the too formal of a word, but pushed forward into your system of what are you, basically what do you annually spend on projects like this, to maybe put it into a better context of how much we're spending in total, rather than isolating on any one project at this point.
Okay, I don't know if I'm gonna have, okay, so I can go back to kind of capital projects from 25 to 30. So when I look at the long-range plan, well, I guess I don't have that with me. I guess as far as projects like this, it varies per year. There's typically, I would say, at least one or two of this size that I do every year. If I'm not sure if I'm answering your question right, but
as in
like in years.
For the building fund, you worked this project, for example, is in the budget.
Correct.
And would fit into your normal course of business over the course of some period of time and improvements to our buildings. So I guess some of my colleagues might have a sticker shock on any given project, but that is what the building fund is for and what we use year in, year out on maintenance and filling out. Obviously, this building had a plan for shell space, and this is what we think is the best use for that space at this point. So I don't know if you'd have anything else to add to that or any other context as we're looking at the building fund itself.
No, I don't. I guess it kind of how it typically works or has in the past, and moving forward, I'll get a request for something like this. We'll get it in the budget and we'll adjust the building fund budget accordingly per project. I haven't had any other requests, I guess, for this space over there.
And then I guess another moving piece for context for my colleagues that you or Tom could probably speak to was we also took some money out of general fund as we were looking for cost cuts within general fund, and we moved it to building fund to be more used for building fund purposes. So in some sense, we took a notch down on general fund and a corresponding notch up on building fund, but you feel you're well funded enough to handle this project. Is that fair?
Yeah, that's fair. And that was just under $800,000 that was removed from my budget in the general fund to the building fund because it was by state statute. It was anything that's related to building and maintenance repairs, so contract services, HVAC repairs, electrical repairs, plumbing repairs, stuff like that.
Sure. So I don't know that we have to get to a decision point firmly on this today, but I would be generally supportive of this as part of the building fund.
Mark, what do these conference rooms look like? I mean, are we talking a lot of cabinetry that's expensive? Or each one going to have their own sink and that type of thing? What are we putting in these conference rooms?
So there's going to be some glass on the interior side, for natural light, but they're basically open conference space. There's no sinks, minimal casework. a lot of the expenses, there's nothing really in there, so you have to add all the MEP, the mechanical, the electrical, won't be really much for plumbing, but,
HVAC.
flooring, ceiling, it's just all wide open, so a lot of the expense is just building it out.
And yeah, I guess I would note that the construction you've got itemized out as $345,000. AVI would be the audiovisual to make it a conference room. You're putting in a lot of equipment to do virtual meetings and whatnot.
Correct.
I think the question on the table right now is, this isn't budgeted in the 2 slides back on the proposed expenditures. I mean, at this point, we're kind of I'm not too sure what Commissioner Bleinberg is on this. We haven't voted on anything, but everybody's kind of showing their hand a little bit. And until maybe Commissioner Benega is, here to offer his opinion on it, I'm seeing kind of a split commission at this point. So,
So it is included in the budget numbers you saw on the previous slide. The decision, and understand what you're saying, we could certainly bring this back either next week or at a future meeting. The decision today would be to keep it in the budget or remove it. But it sounds to me, kind of the direction right now is keep it there for the purpose of having the discussion when Commissioner Benega is present, at which time you can provide guidance on whether it stays or is removed.
okay.
And Mr. Chair, if I could, I was just curious if we had to make a decision today or if we were, if this was a matter of discussion. I have no doubt that that space will be used and it's been, there waiting for something to be done with it. I guess deferring to your experience, you were concerned about the price per square foot. And what would you, I'm just asking Mark and Mr. Chair, if you have any thoughts of where the extra expense, if it's just a basic room, is that just current market rate that is driving the increase in price per square foot?
Is that 1,600 square feet, correct?
Correct.
I mean, you could build a 1,600 square foot house from the ground up for under $400,000. We're talking, I'm really having a hard time with the cost.
And in your opinion, would that be due to just rising construction costs?
Correct. I would say the construction portion of it are, all of the estimates are going to be very accurate.
Are there other options on the table, Mark? This looks like a full build out. And I also agree with Commissioner Karski. I mean, you could build someone's dream home with the amount of money that is specified in these plans. And I do agree, and I think it's a good plan in general to give some additional space to the Human Services Department. I just have some concerns about the price of the project. Are there other plans or options on the table? Maybe we can do half of it, or
I mean, we could look at splitting that out somehow. I don't if that meets Carrie's needs. There's nothing really, I guess, extravagant about the space. It's all commercial grade finishes, right? It's not residential. It's, good flooring, there's a fair amount of glass, maybe we could cut a little bit of cost there, but I don't really have an estimate on how much that would cost, but there's really not much you can do to quote unquote cheapen it up. I mean, with all commercial interior finishes and you're adding all the mechanical equipment, you got to wire the whole thing. And so I guess in my opinion, I don't really see where we could cut costs. I mean, we've reviewed it a couple times. Carrie and I have looked at it a couple times to see where we could cut costs, and there's just really.
Well, I would suggest that we leave it where it is for now, and it's one of those things that's kind of maybe hanging in the balance at this point. So
Okay.
we'll see where we go with it.
Could I ask one follow-up question?
Please.
Could you explain the timeline if this were to stay in the budget, if it were approved? What would the timeline for the project look like?
So, timeline would be probably bid this fall and start construction soon after the first.
Okay,
Okay.
thank you.
All right. You going to talk about the debt service fund?
Nope.
Or? Oh, okay.
I'll sit down. Thanks.
Good morning, Leah Anderson, Auditor's Office. I'm going to give Susan a break and talk a little bit about debt service. So this slide represents Minnehaha County's debt service through 2043. The blue bars show the debt paid by the debt service fund. Property taxes make up about 99% of the revenue to service these payments, and the remaining portion is generated from investment income. The debts paid from this fund, the courthouse addition and admin parking lot bonds, that will be paid off in 2027. When that bond is paid off, the payments will be reduced by $900,000 in 2028. The jail is also part of this. That will be paid off in 2037. And the Juvenile Justice Center, which is a fairly new bond, will be paid off in 2043. Overall, the effective interest rate of these bonds varies from 2.3% to about 5%. The orange bars represent the debt that is paid by the building fund. Property taxes are the primary source of revenue to service these payments. These bonds are serviced with the existing property tax levy, meaning that the levy was not increased to pay off these bonds, but instead stayed unchanged. The debts paid from this fund are both related to the highway shop and equalization building. And there are two bonds. The first would be paid off in 2040, and the second would be paid off in 2041. And the effective rate of interest on these bonds varies from about 2 to 3%. So to give you a little more detail on numbers for 2026, this slide represents the detail of that. We will pay a total of about $9.1 million in debt service total with both funds. So about $7.9 million from the debt service fund and about $1.2 million, just under $1.2 from the building fund. And the reduction in principal, I was just looking at this earlier, would be about $5.5 million, and the rest of that is interest. Any questions?
Leah, overall, what's kind of our position as far as debt? Kind of where do we rate or rank as far as capacity compared to what we're currently using? Have we ever looked at that or discussed that?
I don't know that we've discussed it. The only one that I think in the bonds that we currently have, and Susan could correct me if I'm wrong, for capacity would be Juvenile Justice Center, because when these bonds are set and they're utilized, then we've utilized that debt. So if that's answering your question, I'm not sure.
You know, I
Okay.
guess the rating agencies.
Oh, the rating.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, under statute, I mean, the county can borrow, it's a very high amount that we can borrow. It's like a percentage of values of the property within the county. Last time I looked at it, it's been a while, like $800 million of borrowing that we could do within statute. I would need to update and
Mr.
reevaluate
Chair,
that, but
that could pay for a prison.
it's a very large amount.
And we're at what amount? Total debt?
Yeah, total debt, we are about $100 million in debt.
I have it on here right now. There we go. It's hard to
Principal,
see.
yeah, I left my glasses over there.
It's
It's just about
97.
$98 million in principal that's outstanding. And then, so capacity-wise, I mean, under statute, we have millions and hundreds of millions more that we could legally borrow and be under that required cap. Our county rating, and I can't recall what it was when we did the Juvenile Justice Center, was a very strong rating.
Double A.
Was it double A?
Yeah.
So very strong rating. Obviously, as we look to potentially other borrowings down the road, it's something we would want to maintain. If your rating's lower, your cost of borrowing goes up. And part of when we talk about having stable reserves, that is something that the rating agencies look at. When we did our Juvenile Justice Center borrowing, they flat out said, if your reserves dip significant or you're dipping below a certain threshold, they would see that as an unfavorable change and would warrant evaluation to consider a downgrade. So we really need to be focused on managing our reserves wisely and maintain a healthy level and stable level of reserves just to maintain that fiscal health.
Okay. Okay.
And I think that's what initiated that conversation too about in addition to the fan committee, the 25% that we set for the reserve, that started coming about when we were talking to the bonding or the rating, the Moody rating.
Yep. Okay. Just curious. Thank you.
I have one quick question as well. Is there any advantage to early payment on bonds? And, say interest rates go down in the future, can they be refinanced? Or is there any advantage to doing that?
Well, so I would say there potentially could be advantage, and I would say it's a complicated answer. So bonds are different in the sense that I have a mortgage, I can make an early payment, I can make an extra principal payment, or if I have a car loan, I can prepay those, and there's not penalty usually. Bonds are more complicated than that. So there is abilities at a certain point to do refinances for specifically this courthouse addition. And as we were talking, this issuance year for this bond was 2014, but I believe it was Carrie Deaver said, but we did that project before that. Well, that was a refinance. So we had borrowed the money at a certain rate, and then the previous auditor, I believe it was Bob Litz, said, it was advantageous at that point to do a refinance. So we've been fortunate that, especially in our highway shop borrowings and equalization borrowings, those were at a very good rate. I mean, they were at probably one of the lower areas in the market. The Juvenile Justice Center, obviously the markets had changed when we did that borrowing. We still got a pretty decent rate for that time period, but could we look at refinancing if the situation changed? Absolutely. It is more complicated than just making a payment. So we would have to obviously involve legal counsel, probably bond counsel, and go through that. But it is possible.
Yeah, something to keep in mind.
Yeah.
Okay.
So we just want to show you the preliminary means of finance. So as we move through this, we know we talked significantly about the general fund, the building fund, and the debt service fund. Specifically on the general fund, this is that $11.1 million cash applied that we talked about and discussed. One thing I wanted to note, this is that 5% holdback on appropriations that you're seeing on this line here. That is on every fund that has property taxes. So you're going to see that on 5 funds, general fund, building fund, debt service fund, as well as the library and the fire fund, because those are the 5 funds with property taxes that are for services. So the other thing on this slide that I wanted to note was on the emergency management fund. As you're aware, we do have some grant funding that help funds the emergency management fund, but the rest is done funded by general fund dollars through a form of an interfund transfer to help fund that emergency management fund. Unfortunately, we did receive notice from the state that some of our grant funding would be reduced, so this number is slightly higher than in previous years just because of some reduction in grant. As we talk about these other funds, we weren't going to go into detail in any of these today. If you have certain ones you would like to have detailed conversations on, we certainly can. These are all of the special revenue funds that the county has. There are Generally, self-funding funds. They stand on their own. What you might see here, like you'll see cash applied here for library and fire fund. But again, that's related to that holdback of appropriations that generally we don't see. We see all of those property tax dollars mostly coming in up to that 99% rate consistently. So that those funds aren't decreasing as far as like reserves, or they're able to maintain where they're at. Or if in some cases they might have a little bit higher level in the case of like the M&P fund would have to do with the Register of Deeds. They have adequate reserves to fund maybe a project that they're working on, and that's being handled at that fund level. And then lastly, I'll just point out this new fund of the opioid settlement fund, $196,000 of budgeted revenue. That is what we're predicting of new revenue coming into the fund in 2026 through those various settlements that are flowing through to us. And then we have that budgeted transfer or expense to the link of $300,000. And then we do have a cash applied rate of $103,000. And that's really due to those excess money that we have received in prior years that we're going to be continuing to spend down for purposes of the opioid settlement. So.
I see the E911 fund on there, and just a shout out to our state legislature for removing that sunset on that charge, because when we talk about property taxes, that's one thing that has kept property taxes down, is the revenues that we receive for the 911 to fund Metro Communications and those operations. So that has made a significant impact, 7 figures, I believe, on our.
Yeah, it's a significant impact. And what you see in our budget here is we receive those monies from the state. We pass that money over to the city to help fund Metro. So in total, what you're seeing here, back to that very first slide that we looked at, $122 million for net means of finance, and then $131 million in appropriations, so just over 9.8 million total cash applied across all funds. As we continue to move throughout the budget, we'll be revisiting this slide frequently. And as decisions are made with positions and other expenses, this will be updated and brought back to you. Any questions before we move into personnel? Okay. Well, then I will turn it over to Carrie Deaver to take the next step.
Good morning, Carrie Deaver from Human Resources. Susan's touched on a couple of items with our personnel. As you're all aware of, this is one of your largest costs in your budget. It's also one of our most important as we're looking at our people. You've heard a lot about positions, so I think this is a good place to start. This is a quick summary of the number of new positions that you've added since 2021. Quick note that when you're looking at 2025, that 644 includes 14 positions for UC3, which the jail has done a nice job on holding off on filling quite yet. So if you look at the growth from 2025 to 2021, it's a very nominal increase. I think without those UC3 positions, you're looking at 5% growth over those years. And a quick note on that growth, you've heard over and over again that public safety and justice is a large portion of your budget. That is also where you've been very careful in how you're approving positions, and 85% of the positions you've approved over these years have been for public safety or justice. You've also heard me talk a lot about turnover over the past couple years. As our turnover went up since 2020, we knew that was costing the county money. So we've been very careful in looking at options to try and reduce that turnover, and the good news is we've been successful. We've had a 4% reduction in turnover, and while that might not seem like a lot from a percentage standpoint, it certainly is when you're talking about the number of people who are leaving the county and the cost to losing those individuals. One item of note that I would make here is, while that is a very good news story, if you look prior to 2020, our turnover rate was closer to that 10 to 12%. So that's still maybe a goal for us to look at in the future. Looking at our years of service, you've also heard me talk quite a bit about this. We're very fortunate that a large portion of our population has been with us for 16 or more years, a good 22%. We also have good news that we have been able to successfully recruit over the last couple of years, albeit it's been a little bit more challenging in the past, and we have about 43% of our staff who are new. So if you're looking at that percentage, this goes back again to that bell curve that I've talked about in a couple different ways. A large portion of our staff is new. A large portion of our staff has been with us for a while and is probably approaching retirement soon. So our goal, as we've been talking about the compensation study and other recruitment initiatives and retention initiatives, is to try to grow this employee base right here. Also looking at your personnel by fund. Again, the largest part of your budget is for people. This is a quick overview of how those come out by general, highway, emergency management, 24/7, and your other funds. Obviously, your biggest chunk of employees fall into the general fund at 609. Just one note that this part-time and variable hour line really depends. We have one part-time individual in the general fund, the rest are variable hour, and the number of variable hour employees depends highly on the time of year, whether or not we have elections or whether or not it's the summer. The total personnel budget for these areas, you can see, again, out of the total budget alone, 71% of your budget in general goes towards staff. In highway, that's 20%, 63% for emergency management, 24/7, and of course, there's no personnel for the final. So overall, 54% of your funds are going to support personnel. Another interesting way of looking at this is really by that area of focus. Again, Susan talked about 70% of your costs slightly rising for public safety and justice. You're seeing a similar story here for your positions and your budget. 67.4% of your total personnel budget is for public safety and justice. For general government, you have about 27.2%, highways 5.5%. The pie chart to the right gives you a good visual representation of how that actually plays out from a payroll budget standpoint. Susan has also recapped for you the personnel budget for this year. So just to review that, what is currently included in the proposed budget includes the pay ranges based on the compensation study conducted by McGrath, and with the September 27th implementation, where employees would be placed into those new pay grades at a salary that's closest to, but without losing any pay, of course. And in addition, there's one advanced step to help address compression and to recognize years of service. There's also a 2.7% matrix adjustment for 2026. The personnel budget also includes overtime requests, part-time requests, and all benefits, including FICA and SDRS and insurance. Susan also touched on the 8% increase for health and dental insurance. That is the number we think is appropriate for budgeting again this year. We were fortunate last year, coming into 2025, not to need it, but based on where we're at with health fund expenditures, I still think it's prudent to budget for 8% for next year. What is not included in here is any type of salary adjustment for elected officials. We would recommend that you follow a similar process as you have over the past few years and include approximately maybe $100,000 so that you can make decisions in the future about what you want to do with elected officials for 2026. Also not included in here are staffing requests. And we've talked about how the long-range forecast includes about $750,000 each year for new position requests. This slide, I think, gives a good overview on why maybe that's a prudent number to use for budgeting purpose. It is not uncommon that you'll have requests for new positions, in the double digits. This year, there are only 8 position requests that are entirely new. And just looking at those 8 alone, it's $856,000. So when you're talking about funding an attorney, the cost is $130,000, and that's why that $750,000 can be spent fairly quickly. For 2026, the requests are for security staff at Juvenile Justice Center. I've talked to Director Jamie Gravitt. He's thinking he can delay hiring those people until they're actually needed on site in January of 2027. But to get them up and ready and trained, we'd be looking at about an August hiring date. Even though the positions each have a cost of $85,000, the total cost for 2026 would be that $71,205. Other requests for positions are all full-time, full-year positions. Deputy Public Advocate for the Public Advocate's Office, one position request. The Public Defender's Office is requesting 3 Deputy Public Defenders, and the State's Attorney's Office is requesting 2 Deputy State's Attorneys. A couple other sections here. This position is also not included in the payroll budget. The Public Advocate's Office is requesting to convert 1 currently existing Deputy Public Advocate to a senior trial attorney. Senior trial attorneys are considered supervisory in the office. 2 sections below here are notes. The grant-funded section involves positions that are currently in the budget. And the reason they're in the budget is they've been ongoing. You've often talked to the department heads as they apply for grant-funded positions. The first one listed there is the victim witness assistant that's in the state's attorney's office. That position is funded 25% by the county and 75% by the Department of Public Safety. A quick note about that is it does have a grant year of July 1st to June 30th. The grant year is ending right now in 2025. They have reapplied for that. If for some reason those grants weren't renewed, we would come back and update you on that.
So those aren't new positions?
Correct.
Okay.
That is exactly it. They're not new positions, and so we're funding them as we have in the past.
And going back one to the conversion request for the public advocate, right?
That's correct.
Yeah. How does PDO and PAO, what's the correlation or the number of senior trial attorneys to non-senior trial attorneys? Do we try to maintain some level of staffing that way?
That would be certainly something you might want to look at. Our office does have a chart comparing public defense offices to prosecution offices, and I'd be happy to bring that at the next budget hearing
That
if
would
you're
help.
interested in looking
Okay.
at that.
Thank you.
For those other positions that are funded either by grants or other entities or agencies helping with that, we also have the deputy sheriff position that has been funded partially by outside funds for a period of time. This position is 62% funded by the county. The other portion is funded by the ICJR grant, which also helps fund a deputy state's attorney for intimate partner violence. That grant funds 60% of the position, and the remainder of that position is offset by funds from the Attorney General's office. So overall, about a total county cost of $82,197 for those positions. And again, yes, that is included in the payroll budget right now. Also a note that the payroll budget includes the UC3 positions for 2026 for a half year only. So we budgeted for 2025 for half year only. They were able to delay the need for filling those positions, and the hope is to be able to delay that until next year as well.
So on the UC3 expansion, I mean, if maybe somebody from the Sheriff's Office, Warden, could kind of talk a little bit about that. Where are we? I mean, are we trying to fully step that up? Is this, what does UC3 stand for? I've been so used to saying it, I'm not even sure I know what it means.
Mike Matson, warden of the jail. UC3 is Unit Control 3. It's just the location of that area. Our mission or frame of thought with this expansion is we want to delay it until it's absolutely necessary. Unfortunately, when we're talking about hiring the number of people that we need to hire, we need some lead time to get those positions filled. We're continuously seeing how our population has been trending. Recently, it's been trending a little bit up, but over this last weekend, it kind of went down a little bit. So we're not quite sure what the 2-month anomaly we had. Hopefully, it continues to trend downward, and we can continue to delay the process until July of 26.
July of 26.
Yep.
Okay. And at that point, I mean, we're talking 14 people to run that for the full?
That's 12 corrections officers, two corporals, and that's going to be for 52 beds. So we're doing this in phases where we're moving into it as we need to. So the first phase buys us 52 beds. The next phase gets us up to 100 beds used, and then the last phase is full occupancy with another 48 beds.
So roughly 150, 160 total beds?
148 total beds.
Okay. And we're looking at next year, the initial 50.
Yes, that's what we would hope to do if not delayed even further.
Okay.
Kind of following up on that, what will need the occupancy of the jail be before we move to opening up to UC3? And we kind of range around that 500 level.
We try to operate at 85% of our capacity. So our capacity is 603. Our 85% is about 515. We've been trending in April and May at 552, but we're back down to about 425, 430 right now. So we were high, we're trending back down, we're managing. We'd like to, I don't know the specific number. It's going to have to be staying on that high trend for a period of time where we say, okay, we're going to have to pull the trigger and do this.
Yeah. In other words, that'd be consistently at that 550 or above.
Correct.
Okay. Thank you.
Before I wrap up here, did you have any other questions for Carrie personnel? All right, so I'll move along here with the last few slides of the presentation this morning. First, talking about vehicle requests. And so this particular slide shows vehicles requested. It is these numbers, the values are included within the budget themselves. So today you saw the general fund. Those are these sheriff, jail, and equalization vehicles. There's 9 of them there. Next week you'll see the highway budget, and these vehicles down here are included in that. Not looking for any decisions or guidance today, but these will be revisited next week. We'll bring them back up, and you, at the time, traditionally you would either direct that they remain in the budget, or if needed, remove some from the budget. But all of these are replacements of existing vehicles. The other, yes?
Keeping track of all the moving parts, highway vehicles are funded by the general fund.
Are not.
Are not. They're funded by the wheel tax.
Correct.
Okay, like I said, just trying to keep track of all the moving parts.
General
Okay.
fund up here, highway fund down here. All right, and then the other item that you'll be looking at next week are the outside agency requests. So as Susan mentioned earlier, there's, in terms of the overall request, there's a net increase of about $174,000 requested above the 2025 funding levels. These numbers are not included in the budget that you saw earlier today. We'll bring this back next week. We've also invited outside agencies to come if the commission has any questions about any of these particular requests, but generally they're the same organizations that you've looked at in the past. I do want to note that there are 3 organizations who receive partial funding, or in some cases, all of their funding under this system here through the Domestic Abuse Fund. We'll talk about that more in detail next week. But suffice it to say, we have 18 organizations up here that have requested increases in funding for next year. Right, so speaking of next week, it'll be same time after the commission meeting, starting at 10 a.m. or no earlier than 10 a.m. Primary areas will be the highway fund, outside agency requests, personnel and vehicle requests, and those will be the primary things that are covered next week. So we will be looking for some specific guidance next week, and we'll ensure that read-aheads are obviously posted online and made available to the public. With that, I would open it up for any commission guidance you may have from today. Again, not looking for any specific guidance. You did get a lot of information today. We've jotted some stuff down and things you do want to see at the next meeting. But if there's anything in particular you'd like us to bring back to you next week, we will, above and beyond what I mentioned on the previous slide.
Give us a second.
Yes, I have two thoughts in the form of guidance. And I know we'll talk about the staffing request more next time, but I think, especially to my friends in the public advocate and public defender offices, there are 4 of the 8 positions. I'm inclined to support those. I think I would like us, rather than just seeing those as FTE growth, to think of those as a strategic opportunity to even change the way we do business as defender offices. Looking at the state with its indigent defense taking on appeals, other creative ideas we've kind of bandied about with a third office taking on third level conflicts. Is there something where actually the investment into those positions will actually save us money somewhere else? And so I'm thinking of actually I think that actually technically lands in the court's budget, portion of the budget. But could we, by hiring some of those, is there a way to strategically deploy them to not have to pay less to outside counsel, to private bar? And to that end, I guess I like having the $750,000 goal, Mark. So I guess I'm giving you a hint that it might be nice to find $100,000 of savings through those employment of the extra defenders. Because I think that I've heard from multiple department heads that having a sense that the commission will support $750,000 or so of every year allows you all to work together in the jobs that you're in 365 days a year, whereas we're just up here on a few Tuesdays. It lets you do the real work of managing your departments and ranking those positions amongst yourselves of what's the highest priority. And so it's not just a blank check of $750,000, but it allows you to, again, strategically plan what are the best investments of those $750,000 if we're going to bake those into our forecast. And then secondly, on the outside agency requests, I just think we're in a tough spot this year that I think it's going to be hard to do $174,000 of increases. And then it gets very hard to pick and choose winners and losers of who gets the increase but who doesn't. So barring some explanation or new information, I'm generally inclined to just carry forward the 25 amounts to 26, but willing to hear from each group as needed. But that's just kind of where my head is at on the outside agency requests to keep those relatively flat. But those are my thoughts for today.
I would like a little bit of clarification on it says on the bottom of the staffing request, page 50, the budget includes 2 corporals and 12 correctional officers. So those are already baked into the budget. So it would be the 8 additional. So we'd be looking at an increase of 20 total, 22 total.
Do you want to address that?
The positions at the bottom of that slide are the ones that are included in the budget as they were included in the budget for 2025. The only positions that are being requested from the commission outside of that are these 8 positions here. So the jail doesn't have any additional staffing requests other than these 2 positions for JJC.
They're already in the budget, we just haven't filled them.
Exactly, right.
Okay, got it. That helps. And we have narrative, I know, Tom, for like Compass Center and Lutheran Social Services Violence Project and
Correct.
Lifescape. We've got all their requests, so and those will all be made available to the public for them to.
Their request letters will, yes.
Okay. Because, yeah, we've been, if you look way back in this presentation, our funding to outside agencies has not gone up. In fact, it's remained very flat for probably a decade to most of these. But I mean, it's the world we live in, and we do what we can. But at the same point, I mean, I think we increased ambulance funding a year ago. Not a huge amount, but a significant enough amount. But I'm inclined, as Commissioner Kipley is, to say, boy, it's going to take a lot to, what's the benefit to the county, to the taxpayers, if we increase this? What's the payback, the return on this investment and these increases or requests? So have to look real hard at those from my perspective.
I would echo that, especially thinking budgetarily. I think a lot of times our community partners provide services that end up saving us money, and they probably do it more efficiently, or maybe have less requirements or restrictions on how they provide services. So we appreciate them. They're wonderful. We would love to support them more, but if it could impact our bottom line, I think that's beneficial, thinking of ambulances and the difficult environment that they are all into, and then comparing what the alternative would be for us. So those factors, I think, will be significant for me in considering the outside agencies.
Any other guidance for the next meeting a week from today?
Kind of a general question. Tom, what could we expect at the future budget hearings? Are we going to be approving individual requests for vehicles, staff? We're hearing reports from different departments.
Typically, unless you want to hear from particular departments or outside organizations, you wouldn't necessarily be hearing from them unless you request it. You've had a chance throughout the spring to hear each department within the budget talk, but we could certainly bring them back. But in terms of decision making, final decision, of course, is not made until approval of the budget in September. Next week, for example, what staff would be looking for is direction on those vehicle requests, on the personnel requests and outside agency requests. And basically it's a consensus from the commission to either keep or remove certain items from the budget. Really the next item that you vote on formally would be to file a provisional budget with the auditor, and that'll be done. We're targeting July 22nd right now for that. But in the interim, there could possibly be also a budget meeting on July 8th, depending on the progress of next week.
Excellent, thank you.
Otherwise, Commission Chair, that concludes our presentation for the day.
All righty. So we are at the opportunity for public comment. Anybody like to address the commission on any item? All right. I'd look for a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
Second.
All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, same sign. We are adjourned. All right. Thank you, everybody.